One of my favorite characters in all of literature is somebody named Puddleglum. Maybe you've met Puddleglum. You've met him if you have read this book that I'm holding in my hand called The Silver Chair, one of C.S. Lewis's books in the so-called Chronicles of Narnia series. Puddleglum is one of my favorite characters, and he appears in this book. If you haven't met Puddleglum, let me just tell you a little bit about him and why I love him so much. Puddleglum appears in The Silver Chair as a marshwiggle, a character that C.S. Lewis comes up with. He has kind of frog-like hands, like web-like hands and feet, but also looks a bit like a man. He's a very odd character. Came out of C.S. Lewis's incredible imagination. But Puddleglum is a tremendous pessimist. And that's, I think, the main reason why I love Puddleglum so much. So just to kind of fill you in a little bit on the story here, if you haven't read The Silver Chair, I highly recommend it to you. It's a wonderful book for adults to read, but also wonderful to read to children. The basic storyline is that you have two children, Jill and Eustace, who are going on an adventure. They're going on a journey. They have to travel down into the underworld to rescue a prince who's being held captive by a witch. Now, I teach medieval and ancient literature, so I love this book because it's full of all sorts of really cool allusions to medieval stories and to ancient stories, heroes going down into the underworld to rescue a prince, that sort of thing. It's everywhere in that kind of literature, so I love this book for that. But one of the things that I love about the book is the character Puddleglum. Puddleglum accompanies the children on their journey, and he's a total pessimist. So when they invite him on the journey, he says, you know, I think this will be a great type of journey for me to go on. It sounds like it has no hope of success. That'll be great. And along the way, as they're traveling down into the underworld to rescue this prince, Puddleglum tries to cheer up the children by giving them little tips and hints and things like that as they go along. But because he's a pessimist, his attempts at encouragement don't quite work. So at one point they're climbing down a mountain and there's a river at the bottom of it, and Puddleglum says, I think we're going to fall and break our necks, but that's okay because then at least we won't drown in the river. Puddleglum tells the children that one of the ways that he gets through a day if he's having trouble is by thinking about how much worse the next day might be. So he's a total pessimist. But one of the things that's really funny about Puddleglum is Puddleglum thinks that he's an optimist. Puddleglum, among marshwiggles, is seen as something of a cheery chap. And so he tells the children that going on this fruitless, pointless journey will actually be good for him among the marshwiggle community because it's the sort of thing that will put a serious view of life into him. I love Puddleglum because there's a sense in which I'm a Puddleglum myself. I'm very much of a pessimist. I'm very much the type of person that will tell you that the glass is half empty. And it's not just half empty because there isn't enough water in the glass, it's half empty because the world's running out of water. I have that type of personality myself. But I also think that a lot of church historians have the role in theology of serving as Puddleglums. You know, when people say, the world has never been worse, the cause of the church has never been more desperate. It's the church historian who says, wait, no, it's gotten a lot worse in the past. Let's look at the Crusades. You know, let's look at the corrupt popes. You know, when someone says, I've never seen the church more sold out to politics. I've never seen more of our leaders more convinced that they can sell the gospel in exchange for some fame or some notoriety. You know, I think, well, have you studied the war popes? Have you looked at some of the leaders in the Crusades? Things have been way worse. So cheer up. Things have been worse in the past. The job of the church historian sometimes is to cheer us up by reminding us that as bad as things might be right now, they've been worse in the past. Many of us are going through this situation with coronavirus and this situation where we feel a tremendous lack of control. We're not sure what God is doing in the world. We're not sure what's happening around us. When I was at the grocery store a few days ago, I felt a little bit like I was living through a plague. Everybody was kind of looking at me out of the corner of their eye. You know, are you carrying coronavirus? Am I going to catch it from you? In the midst of this kind of situation, which is very difficult for many of us, it helps sometimes to be reminded that things have been worse in the past. Our lesson today is going to focus on a faithful Christian who was living at a time when things probably couldn't have gotten much worse. A man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of my own personal heroes, somebody who had a huge impact on me as a young man. And I'm really, really looking forward to talking with you all a little bit about Dietrich Bonhoeffer today. Before we do that, Let me invite you to turn in your scriptures to the Gospel of Matthew, and I think you'll quickly see why I chose this particular text for a class on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But turn to the Gospel of Matthew, and turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 4, and we're going to read starting in verse 18. I suspect this is a passage that's familiar to many of you. It's a passage where we hear about Jesus calling his disciples. Starting in verse 18 of chapter 4, we read, "As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. 'Come, follow me,' Jesus said, 'and I will make you fishers of men.' At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him." Let's pray together. Our Father, we come to you this morning, and we think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the servants of the church, someone who lived during a time that was so much worse than our own time in so many ways. We think of his faithfulness. We thank you that we have examples like this to look at of people who have been faithful in the midst of crises, in the midst of very hard circumstances. So I ask you that you would be with us, that you would remind us that you are with us, and that you love us. Cause all of the things that we think and say and do in this coming week to be honoring to you. We ask you these things for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, we're going to look a little bit at this character, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I mentioned that he was very, very influential to me, especially as a young man. He was very influential to me when I read a book of his called The Cost of Discipleship. Maybe you've heard of that book. It's a book where he makes his famous statement that when Jesus calls a man, he bids him come and die. And I remember reading that as a teenager and being really captivated by that. What Dietrich Bonhoeffer was saying in that book that caught my attention is that when Jesus was calling the disciples, he was calling them to follow him even unto death. Just like when he calls you or me to follow him, he calls for the same thing, that we follow him even unto death. Now, what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was saying in that really, really captured my imagination, and a lot of people since have read that and been really, really changed by reading those statements of Bonhoeffer, is that the gospel is costly. He talks about costly grace as opposed to cheap grace. You see, cheap grace means I walk down the aisle, I sign the card, I sign up as a Christian, and I'm good. Costly grace means, no, the gospel actually changes your life. The gospel actually changes the way you interact with your neighbor, with your friends, with your family. The gospel means sometimes taking risks, as we'll see Dietrich Bonhoeffer did. The gospel might even mean giving up your life for those you love. Dietrich Bonhoeffer did just that. I'm going to give you his dates very quickly here. He was born in 1906 and he died in 1945. As I always say, it isn't a class about dates, but one thing I would encourage you to remember is that he dies on April 9th of 1945. And if there are any World War II buffs in the class, as I think there are a few, you know that April of 1945 is just about a month before the Germans surrender to the Allies. Dietrich Bonhoeffer died a month before World War II came to an end in Europe. He died at the hands of the Nazis. Why? Because Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to a point in his life where he decided he could no longer permit Nazi rhetoric and Nazi actions to go unobstructed. And he decided to actually actively fight against the Nazis and actively fight against Hitler. As we'll see, he became part of a plot to overthrow and kill Hitler. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer meant by saying that the gospel and grace aren't cheap, they're costly. You've got to have skin in the game, so to speak, for Bonhoeffer. And we'll see that as we look at his life a bit together today. A little bit about his background. He came from a wildly successful family in Germany. When he was born, his mother and father were sort of part of the intelligentsia of the day in Germany. His father was a very successful psychiatrist. His father had kind of made a name for himself pushing back against some of the psychiatrist Sigmund Freud's more crazy ideas. His father was very, very well educated, very intelligent. His mother, likewise, was sort of royalty in her day, very, very well educated, very smart. And both of the parents encouraged and pushed all of the Bonhoeffer children. You can read more about some of this if you get a book that I'm just going to hold up for you. It looks like a big door stopper, but it's a book that was very popular a number of years ago. It's a very well-written book called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy by a man named Eric Metaxas. Now, I'll give you a bit of a disclaimer to this, that the friends of mine in church history who study Bonhoeffer for a living have serious problems with this book. They feel like Metaxas at points goes too far to try to make Bonhoeffer into a modern American evangelical, which he wasn't necessarily. But with that caveat, it's very well written, very informative, and you can read a lot about Bonhoeffer's early years and indeed his entire life in this book. So the book is Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, probably a play on Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, if you're familiar with that book and series. But in any event, it's a book written by Eric Metaxas. It's very readable, very helpful. As you read and study about Bonhoeffer's life, you learn that he was in a family where conversation was very important. A number of scholars of Bonhoeffer have noted this, that his parents encouraged dinnertime conversation, but they encouraged the kids to say things that made sense. Bonhoeffer's father in particular would call the children out if they were not logical and rational in the way that they spoke. And this seems to have had a big effect on Bonhoeffer. He was encouraged to excel in whatever pursuit he chose for a career. When he was very young, about the age of 12, Germany was involved in World War I, and Bonhoeffer's older brother actually died fighting for the German cause in World War I. This seems to have had a big impact on Bonhoeffer, and as a young man, perhaps as an early teenager, he made the decision to become a theologian. Now, this is really interesting in Bonhoeffer's story, that he decided to become a theologian, but it wasn't necessarily because he'd had some profound conversion experience or anything like that. From what we can tell, it seems like Bonhoeffer's father was perhaps a nominal Christian and his mother was somewhat devout. But Bonhoeffer didn't have some crazy conversion experience. Instead, he decided to go be a theologian and pursue that as an academic pursuit, to be a theologian and pastor, to make his living in that calling. And he pursued that. He seems to have gotten his PhD in record time. He impressed his professors. He went to some of the best schools in Germany where there was a long tradition of rigorous theological scholarship. He impressed his professors. He impressed his fellow students, and actually graduated very, very early with a PhD. So early that he decided to go and get some more graduate work done. So he did postgraduate study here in the United States. He came to New York City and went to a seminary in New York City, studied there, and that seems to have had some effect on him, but mostly the effect was negative. Bonhoeffer's impression of American scholarship as somebody who'd been raised and trained in Germany was pretty negative. He didn't think that our theological scholarship was terribly rigorous. That's probably a judgment that is still true to some extent to this day. The Germans tend to take scholarship more seriously than we do as Americans, I'm sad to say. But in any event, Bonhoeffer did have something happen to him when he was living in New York City that had a huge impact on him. It could be something that we would call a turning point of sorts in Bonhoeffer's life. Bonhoeffer worshiped in a black church, and he made black friends. And Bonhoeffer realized, remember this is, the early part of the 20th century in American history, we're talking the 1920s. Bonhoeffer realized that there was segregation within the church in America. He realized that black churches worship separately from white churches. And he started asking the question, what has the gospel done for these churches? What does the gospel mean if I can worship with my black brother or sister in church and yet can't eat with the same person at a restaurant because there's segregation enforced by the government but also enforced by individuals, many of whom would have called themselves Christians? Bonhoeffer has a really, really tremendous experience worshiping in the black Christian community of New York City. He enjoys the spirituals that are sung in the worship service. He enjoys the vibrancy of theological life within the black church. See, Bonhoeffer had pursued theology as an academic career. He was rigorous academically, but he hadn't developed that lively sense of what the gospel does in your life. And he learned that, he saw that in effect in the black churches in New York City. In particular, he saw what the gospel meant to groups of people who are being oppressed. This had a very big impact on him. How can you call yourself a follower of Christ and yet treat a fellow human being, even a fellow Christian, like dirt? Bonhoeffer couldn't see how that could work. When you look at a book like The Cost of Discipleship, and as I mentioned earlier, the idea that you have to have skin in the game as a Christian, to Bonhoeffer, there is no such thing as a cheap Christian. There is no such thing as somebody who says, I'm a follower of Christ, and yet turns to their neighbor or turns to their fellow Christian and treats them in a way that is not honoring of their dignity as somebody made in the image of God. So Bonhoeffer's time in New York City had a really big impact on him. As I mentioned, you can read more about all of this in Eric Metaxas's work on Bonhoeffer, and you can find it in some other places as well. I'll send out as a resource in the email a link to Focus on the Family, who did a radio drama or radio theater presentation of Bonhoeffer's life. And there's some really, really interesting observations in that in terms of Bonhoeffer's change of heart in this time that he was living in New York City and encountering racism and encountering oppression very, very close to hand. In any event, if you know anything about your Western history and your European history, you know that in the 1920s, things were not so good in Germany. Germany had lost the war to the Allied powers in World War I. Germany was struggling. There was a war debt that had to be paid to the Allied powers. There was rampant unemployment. There was rampant inflation. There are amazing stories from this period, probably anecdotal, but the idea of German inflation being so great that it was called hyperinflation. If any of you have a background in economics or finance, you know what I'm talking about, but it's where the value of the currency is falling by hundreds or thousands of percents a day, to the point where somebody's getting paid by an employer and rushing to the market to pay with the currency because it's losing its value by the minute. There's a funny story, it may not have happened, but it captures this kind of time of a woman carrying a basket of her Deutschmarks, which are losing their value as she's walking with them. She's got a basket of them because she's going to the market to buy just a couple loaves of bread. She's robbed by people who steal the basket and dump the currency out. Okay? That's how bad things were. There's hyperinflation, there's unemployment, there's instability, there's a rise of far left-wing parties in Germany, far right-wing parties, and as we all know, what emerges out of that is someone who has promised to bring peace and stability and security to Germany. We all know this story. You know, Adolf Hitler got his rise to power explaining to the German people why they had lost the war. It's an old phenomenon, but of course, you find a group of people that you can blame for a social ill, sometimes called scapegoating. Hitler went to great lengths to explain to the German people, in many of his speeches, some would call them diatribes, to the German people, that it was actually the Jews who were responsible for Germany's loss in the war. It was the Jews who were responsible for Germany's current malaise, the problems that were happening in Germany. And Hitler tapped into many, many stereotypes of Jews that had been common in Europe for hundreds of years. You know, that they were murderers and rapists, that they were bankers, that they were powerful, that they were controlling the German economy, that they were only out for themselves. You all know this story. In essence, Hitler identified a group of people and said, the reason we're having trouble is because of them. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of this is that the church in Germany, on the whole, went along with Hitler. This is one of the most amazing things that could have happened in the history of the church in Germany. They said, okay, you've got a point. There was a German church that grew up in Germany that was going to be an Aryan church, a Nazi church. The majority of churches in Germany, especially Protestant churches, went over to Hitler. You can see footage of this when you see altars in Germany that had swastikas on them. There was a movement in the German churches to get rid of the Old Testament. You know, the Old Testament is really problematic for you if you're a Nazi who wants to call himself or herself a Christian, right? So there were movements to get rid of the Old Testament. There were movements to try to say that Jesus had actually been an Aryan and so on. This is all happening when Bonhoeffer comes back to Germany as a young man. And what does he do? Well, because he thinks the gospel matters, because he doesn't believe in cheap grace, he stands up. He gives speeches against Hitler. He becomes a leader in a movement of churches in Germany called the Confessing Church. The confessing church movement was a small group of churches in Germany that stood up to Hitler. One of the most amazing things in the scholarship, and we won't dive too much into the scholarship on this, and it's not my area of specialty, but friends of mine who study this will tell me that even within the confessing church movement, many of the leaders, even within that movement that was sticking up to Hitler, were doing so on ecclesiastical grounds. Many of even those leaders were okay with Hitler's anti-Jewish policies. They just didn't want Hitler to interfere with the independence of the Protestant churches. It's a really scary time to be a Christian in Germany. It's a really scary time for Dietrich Bonhoeffer to be speaking and writing against Hitler and the Nazis. He's doing his best to warn people about what happens when a group of people are scapegoated, when a leader speaks of them as vermin or speaks of them as an infection on the nation. What that leader is doing is preparing for a time when they will be exterminated, and Bonhoeffer knew that, so he spoke up. He gave radio broadcasts, he wrote, he spoke around the world, and what do you think the Nazis did? Of course, they shut him down as fast as they could. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during the 1930s, opened an illegal seminary where he and other seminary students met, and he trained seminary students to go out for the work of the pastorate in Germany in the confessing churches. But of course, the Nazis shut that down as well. Many of Bonhoeffer's students were killed on the Eastern Front, serving as chaplains in the German military. Many more of them were killed by the Nazis. It's a really, really difficult time to be alive. You know, anytime I'm tempted to be discouraged about the church's role in the world right now, the church's place in terms of politics and the politicization of the gospel and those sorts of things. I remember a time when there were swastikas on altars in German churches. So to be a puddle glum for you all, cheer up. There have been times when it's been worse. In any event, Bonhoeffer faces a really, really critical crisis of conscience at this point. He is a male in Germany, which means he's subject to conscription. He does not want to serve in the military and fight for Hitler, of course, but he's still a German. He's been raised in a culture which respects authority. Going back to our class on Martin Luther, you remember that it was the Protestant princes of Germany that had brought about the Reformation in large parts of Germany. So as a German Protestant, he respects the leaders. And yet he's seeing his country headed toward an abyss. He's seeing a leader who is scapegoating groups of people. He is seeing all sorts of injustice around him, and he wants to know what to do. What can he, as a good German, but also a good Christian, do? This is really difficult for Bonhoeffer. There's a lot of scholarship about Bonhoeffer in this period in terms of this crisis of conscience that he has. Should he actually join the resistance to Hitler? And is doing so violating his obligations as a German citizen? Is it violating his obligations as a Christian to submit to the powers that be, right? Paul and Peter in the New Testament tell us to submit to the authorities that God has given us. You can find one really fascinating passage in Bonhoeffer's writings. It's always stuck with me, where he talks about this crisis of conscience. And he gives as an example this image of a little girl who's in her classroom. And the teacher calls the little girl out in front of the rest of the classroom and asks her, "Is your dad a drunk?" And sadly, the little girl's dad is a drunk. And Bonhoeffer says, if she says no, to protect her father's honor in that classroom, is it a lie? He doesn't fully answer it for us. We had a class on Augustine, and you know this. Augustine would have said yes. The little girl should not say that. But Bonhoeffer isn't sure. He's wrestling with really, really fine points of ethics. Okay. Is it a worse crime for me to sit and let a monster like Hitler exterminate people than it is to actively resist him? There comes a point in Bonhoeffer's life where he decides not just to bandage the wounded who are being broken by this wheel of oppression, but actually to stand up and try to jam the wheel of oppression. And he uses imagery like that when he talks about this. He decides to actively join the resistance. He does. And you remember the Bonhoeffer family is very well connected, so it probably won't surprise you that his brother-in-law Hans is very well placed in the German Abwehr. The German Abwehr is their intelligence body, the intelligence body of the German government. Starting in the 1930s, and many of you will know this, but starting in the 1930s, there were plots to kill Hitler. And each one seemed to fail by just a little bit. There was a bomb that was placed on a plane to kill Hitler. It didn't go off. over and over and over, there were generals and leaders within the German military and in the German government who were trying to kill Hitler, but they kept failing. Hitler kept missing the deadline that he needed to be somewhere, or showing up late, or whatever, and the assassination plot would fail. Bonhoeffer, through his brother-in-law Hans and some others, got connected with the plots to forcibly overthrow Hitler. He began working for the German resistance to Hitler. Now, this is a time when the Gestapo is powerful. This is a time when the SS is reigning in Germany. It is not a good time to sign up to try to overthrow someone like Hitler. And yet Bonhoeffer thought that it was his duty as a Christian to do so. Even with a conflicted conscience, even with the questions that remained to him, he thought it would be a worse evil not to do this. It's a really interesting question, and I'm not here to answer it for you, but it's a really interesting question to ask yourself, what would I do in that situation? Yes, God commands me to submit to authorities. Hitler kind of was elected, so he's sort of almost like a legitimate authority. People forget that Hitler won his first election. He was made the Chancellor of Germany in a lawful process early in the 1930s. So here's a legitimate authority. I, as a Christian, have an obligation to submit to it. And yet this authority is exterminating a whole people group and many, many others, is taking the country into unlawful wars and so on. Bonhoeffer struggled with that for his whole life. In any event, Bonhoeffer spent a number of years working for the Abwehr, ostensibly, like on the surface, as an agent for the German intelligence service, but beneath the surface, he was actually working as part of the plot to overthrow Hitler. Of course, it's a tragic ending. He's discovered, and a number of other people are discovered as part of this plot. He's arrested, he's interrogated. If you do read the Eric Metaxas book, he goes to great lengths to show how clever Bonhoeffer was in the interrogations, how good he was at throwing off the interrogators. Bonhoeffer would write letters from prison back to his family, and was very good at giving them a surface level of meaning in the letter, but then beneath it, conveying to them secret codes and things like that. He was a really good spy. In any event, Bonhoeffer is in prison starting in 1943 and is eluding his interrogators. He keeps tripping them up. He keeps avoiding answering the question in a way that would incriminate him or incriminate others. Yet, in July of 1944, the unthinkable happens. The plot to kill Hitler in a plot called Operation Valkyrie goes horribly wrong. They place a bomb under the table in a conference room in Hitler's office. He's in a meeting with a number of his generals. A bomb goes off and it doesn't kill Hitler. Many of you know this story. It's one of the craziest twists in history. The bomb is placed under the table next to a thick wooden leg of the table that somehow rescues Hitler. Hitler survives and is now on a vendetta. The stories about this are traumatizing because one of the things that Hitler did is found anybody who had been opposed to him in any way in the years prior and used this as an excuse to torture and kill them. Hitler had videos made of the execution so he could watch them in his spare time. It was brutal. It's a terrible, terrible time to be living in Germany. Bonhoeffer, as a result of this and as a result of the waves of arrests that are taking place in Germany of co-conspirators of Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer is finally fully outed. He's taken to a number of prisons and a number of camps, but finally the Flossenburg prison camp in Germany. Very, very tragically, Bonhoeffer is executed at the Flossenburg prison camp for his crimes against Germany after the ultimate kind of show trial. He and his brother-in-law and many other co-conspirators are hanged at the Flossenburg prison camp. There's a lot of controversy about the details of his death. It was very likely not a nice death. Hitler was not nice to the people he thought had conspired to kill them. Tragically, the death takes place about a month before Germany surrenders to the Allies. Up to the very last, Hitler and the Nazis were intent on killing anyone they thought had been part of the conspiracy against Hitler. Bonhoeffer's last words are really, really compelling. He said, in the last thing he ever wrote, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning." Why did he say that? Why could he say that? How could he say that? Because he thought that the gospel mattered. He believed in an afterlife. He believed in the rewards that he would receive in the afterlife. But he also believed that he had done the right thing, that the gospel had compelled him as a good German, as a good Christian, to stand up to the evil he saw around him. Now, what can we draw from this? Well, I think there are a number of things that we can draw from this. One of them is to cheer up. Things have been worse. As much as it can be depressing to live during a time of coronavirus, as much as it can be depressing to see the chaos all around us, I think of that great line in the poem by W.B. Yeats, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. I wish somebody would just footnote that to Facebook, right? Or Instagram or whatever, okay? We live in a time where the best are lacking of all conviction and the worst are full of passion and intensity. We live in a time of uncertainty. We live in a time when the church in so many ways has lost its way. And yet we know at times it's been even worse. So cheer up. We also know, though, that Bonhoeffer believed that the gospel mattered. Bonhoeffer believed that there was no such thing as cheap grace, that if Jesus calls you, he bids you come and follow him even unto death. And we know that as Christians, that we have an obligation as Christians to look out for each other, to look out for those who are oppressed, to those who are being broken on the wheel of oppression. The gospel matters in our lives, as it did to Bonhoeffer. Let me close us in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for our time together, for this chance to look at one of the heroes of the faith, to look at the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We ask that we would be encouraged as we go from here, partly just because there have been times in the past when things have been worse, but partly because we are reminded that the gospel actually matters in our lives, as it did for Bonhoeffer, that we have an obligation as Christians to serve you, that we have an obligation to look out for each other and to look out for those who are the least among us. We ask you that we would be encouraged by this, that we would go from here, and that in this coming week and in these coming weeks that we would be living out the gospel in our lives. We ask you all these things for Jesus' sake. Amen.